Now, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, we're going to be doing an analysis of Heaton's Just As I Am. Now, I was very pleased to have been joined by Paul Hindmarsh for this analysis. As you'll hear Paul speak about, he had many conversations with Heaton and developed a close friendship with him. Paul is a well-renowned journalist and author on all things brass band, particularly Heaton's music, and as well as writing Heaton's biography and completing and publishing many of Heaton's unfinished sketches. Paul is also the artistic director of the Royal Northern College of Music Brass Band Festival every year, and for many years was also a producer for BBC Radio 3 and encouraged the commissioning of many new pieces for brass band from some very notable composers. In September 2020, Paul was also the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award for his work with Brass Bands England. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Paul to talk about Wilfred Heaton's piece, Just As I Am. So first of all, thank you ever so much for joining us and giving up your time to join us on the podcast today. For those of you that don't know you, perhaps you could start off just telling us how you first came across the music of Wilfred Heaton.
Well, great to be here. Actually, I'm really enjoying the podcast and looking forward to talking about Wilf Heaton's music. I first came across it in the Salvation Army because that's where I was brought up, and I suppose I was in my early teens, and I really took notice of, as everybody does, that I've spoken to, the March Praise. In my later teens, when I was beginning to study classical music, I thought how well this music related to what I was experiencing outside the Salvation Army. Pieces like Intercede, O Lord for choir, which was extraordinarily adventurous, I thought, for Salvation Army music. As I said, the March Praise, Toccata. I've never come across music like that within the Salvation Army, and it always intrigued me. And I promised myself then, in my late teens, early 20s, if I ever got the chance to develop his music, to work on his music more, then I would. And that opportunity came actually when I was at the BBC 30 years ago now, nearly, and when we met. And I started to try to get some of his larger pieces broadcast and performed, because they hadn't been played, and some of them weren't even quite finished. So that was a great adventure. And I met him in the early 90s, and then we kept in touch during his last decade. And I promised him, actually, I suppose it was one of our last phone calls, and he passed away just a few weeks later. And I said, Wilfred, I never called him Wilf, I always Wilfred, I'm going to write your biography one day. Oh, really? Do you have to? and I thought, oh, well, I said, yes, I do. And he said, if you do, remember one thing, keep my life and my music separate. I didn't know what he meant at the time, because I always thought one's music came out of one's being, as it were, one's personality at the time you wrote it. But of course, later on, I came to realize that all the music that we know in the Salvation Army from Wilfred Heaton, most of that was written when he was very young. And some of it didn't appear in print until very much later. So pieces like Toccata, for example, he wrote that when he was about 18, 19 in its first version. And it wasn't published until the 70s. So the Salvation Army audience knew Just As I Am, which we're going to talk about in a minute. They knew Praise. They knew Martin, which is a beautiful arrangement. And a little piece called Passing By, which has got passed by. It's not often played, but it's very touching. But for me, of all those pieces he wrote before he was 20, it's Just As I Am, I think, that for me, that shows such maturity of expression, coherence. He sort of takes that little tune and owns it.
Absolutely, and we'll look into a bit more detail of exactly how he owns it in a few minutes. Now, perhaps you've alluded to it in that sort of introduction there, but what is it specifically that makes the music of Heaton stand out to you?
Well, it's the craftsmanship, first of all. It's elegant. It's beautifully considered. He cherished every note he wrote, every note he put down, even from his youngest days. I've got here on my computer a cornet solo he must have written when he was 14 or so. Sounds like it ought to have been written 50 years earlier, because it's one of those air vary solos. But it's beautifully written. Even as a young man, he was considering every note. So it's the beauty of it. It's the range and craft. And for me, it's the expression.
So just to gauge some context around the writing of the piece, I believe that you spoke to Heaton about this piece and how it came about.
It was in our very last phone call in March 2000. And he rang me to say he'd just put in the final touches to a very large piece called Variations. And then I asked him about his earlier pieces, his Salvation Army music, and he said he was particularly pleased with Just As I Am because he was concerned to make it flow. That was his concern within the Salvation Army. I want to do a good job for the Salvation Army. That was exact words to me. And by that, I think he meant he wanted to get away from the sort of episodic nature of a lot of it, especially when he was brought up in the 30s, that it was compose 16 bars, insert a hymn tune, compose 16 more bars, insert a hymn tune. And sometimes those didn't relate terribly well. But in Just As I Am, he wanted to create an organic whole. And I think in that, his biggest influence was George Marshall.
So you talked about the tune written by William Bradbury in 1849 with the words by Charlotte Elliott. Why do you think that Heaton chose this particular hymn tune?
Well, first of all, I think it's because he'd heard it being sung and played and wanted to write something based on it. And as I've been working through his music, I've noticed that he likes a tune which is either very simple, with simple and very easily audible intervals or characteristics, or something which he then can use like a quarry for ideas. This has become a very popular piece, and you ask people, which piece of Wilfred Heaton's do you really like? Do you admire the most? Most brass banders and people who know his music will say praise, and they'll say Just As I Am. What a lovely piece. Now, perhaps they can't tell you why it's lovely and why it feels so right, but it feels right because he's considered, as I said earlier, he's considered all his themes and his ideas, which unfold and develop like an organism, as it were. There's a journey there, but it's all derived from the characters, from the intervals within the tune itself. It extends over an octave from G to G, and towards the end, the compass is just a sixth from the B to the G. And whether it's conscious or not, he's used that right at the start, that tortuous solo cornet line, which I know he did that a few times in his pieces. It's yearning because he's just giving a bit of tension between the interval, just to move the ear always forward. But it's derived in its essence from elements within the tune itself. There's a sort of hesitancy at the start, isn't there? It's an interpretive thing, I think. It's a favourite word that Wilfred Heaton uses, called slentando, which means just slow down a touch, just point it. Dee, 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 da, da, da. But we've gone nowhere. We're still in the first bar. So this is someone who's hesitant, who's prayerful, but is unsure about how to progress. And you can hit the trombones do exactly the same thing. We're actually in E minor, and the trombones just interrupted. They go on to C, which is, in conventional harmonic language, the interrupted cadence. But we've only got to the bar 2. Dee da dum pom pom. Now what do? We move, and the melody is like a song without words. We can't sing it because the intervals are rather extreme in places. That octave that comes regularly through it is important because it's always moving our ear on. And the dotted note, dee da da, appears all the way through. The interval of the octave, as I say, appears all the way through, either as an open harmonic fill, which we hear it in the trombones, not too far from the start, and gradually then it appears in more assertive terms until that big climax when the octaves really sound. But gradually he brings in the tune. We're hesitant at the start. There's lots of wefts of counterpoint. That little theme that we hear in the cornet threads its way through the band. And then in bar 8 or 9 there, where the euphoniums take over Wilfred's melody, the trombones actually take on the first 3 notes of Just As I Am, hidden away, and taken over by the baritones, and then the harmony opens out. and we move from a rather nervous, uncertain E minor, and then the tune opens out into G major with the second inversion at the bottom. So we're expecting more, but the tune comes very simply on two trombones. It's a prayer, simply done with humility, taken over by the cornets, and then filled in by an octave in the baritones. It's simple, but it's just to the point.
And you're absolutely right about that opening solo cornet part. Of all the bands and all the times I've played, this never seems to get any easier. Proper edge of the seat moment. And you mentioned the score as well. As usual with these analyses, our listeners are able to download the score from the Salvation Army Music Index if you'd find it useful to pick through and look through the score as you listen to this. You can find it just by Googling it from the Salvation Army Music Index. So we got to letter A there, the first iteration of the tune, Just As Thou Art. Could you talk us through the way Heaton treats this tune?
I don't know whether Wilfred was thinking pictorially here, but there is a picture, isn't there, of just very simple, just people sitting or kneeling and praying or simply singing the hymn. And I think that stands out as a contrast. Very simple harmony, actually it's presented in thirds all the way through with straightforward harmony notes underneath, supporting notes in the basses, which is a stark contrast to the contrapuntal and melodic, rather emotional, as it were, language in the rest of the work.
So that takes us through to letter B. Now, letter B to C is only 8 bars, yet it proves to be a significant section in the transition of the piece. Why do you think that this section B to C here helps the music flow through as we approach letter C and beyond?
It's all part of that expressive journey. I think structurally the piece is a bit like a rondo. The music at the start and then the hymn are the basis of the piece, and then he gradually takes those two and develops them as he goes. Those two episodes, as it were, those two sections become the basis of what happens next. And that section B to C and then C to D, they're what I would call developmental, in that the music we've heard right at the start becomes more urgent, more expressive. The intervals are wider. If you think of that little dotted phrase, dee, da, 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 and then you look at B, it goes, and moves our ear and our thoughts further. The harmony is more directed. It doesn't interrupt itself, because the little dotted motif actually is then heard in the middle of the band, the euphoniums soaring away there with the horns. And then again, when we get to letter C, that rising figure becomes an octave in the cornets. We hear it first, and it's almost as if we've gone back to the beginning, because the music is very similar to the start, but not quite similar, but not the same, because it's always moving us on. We've gone to a remoter key. It's a sharper key, so it's sort of ratcheting up the tension, if you like. And the melody has been, that little motive has been divided up. The cornets taking a line, the underneath instruments then taking the contrapuntal, answered by the cornets. And then it empties itself out. And then we've got to rather a bleak place, because the trombones just take that octave that we heard right at the start, and that's all we hear. And it's as if that's more or less the halfway point of the piece. And in a conventional meditation, you'd probably expect the second version of the verse to appear then. And I'm just looking at the words here, actually. Just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict, many a doubt, fightings and fears within, without, O Lamb of God, I come. I think you can hear some of that tension, some of that in the fragments that he's delivering for us. But at letter D, where we'd expect the tune to come again, we have the same length of bars, but the tune is fragmented. We only hear a little bit of it. We hear it on the horn, da da dee da da, and that's answered by what the cornets played at the start, and his own little theme, da dee da 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 dee da da. We're in the minor key too, da da dee, and it's answered again, said again, and it's articulated again. It's repeated more urgently this time with the answering phrase further higher in the cornets. So the tension is rising all the time. And if you look at the words, rather than deliver a verse, he's, as it were, condensing the expression of these words. Just as I am, poor, wretched, blind, sight, riches, healing of the mind. Then the verse 4, just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt pardon, cleanse, and relieve. And I think we're hearing some of that expression within the music here. And I was talking about that octave just before this fragmentary hymn appears. We then hear it right at the very top of the band in the soprano, cornet, and flugelhorn. And I think that's a signal for us, because then at letter E, if you're following the score, the basses come in with another theme. Bo, 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 bo. There's an octave range, and there's just as I am in the three rising notes. But it's calmer, it's slower, and it's sort of like a recapitulation of the opening. But there's a greater assurance in the expression. There's a firmer tread in the bass. And if you look at verse 4, because thy promise I believe, O Lamb of God, I come. So there's a greater certainty now in this next bridge passage, this sort of reprise, developing all the time, and a confidence. And that's how he builds the texture towards that extraordinary climax, which seems at first, if someone hears the piece for the first time, maybe rather too big for what we've heard. But of course, there's a confidence there. And you think of verse 5, just as I am, thy love unknown has broken every barrier down. Now to be thine, yea, thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come. And for me, when I see letter F and I see the way that climax works, which that octave has now gone right to the top of the band on the soprano cornet and solo cornets, and ba-bam, ba-bam, the dotted rhythms we heard at the start, they're not nervous, equivocal, they're now absolutely assertive. Musically, it's just his way of creating a climax and creating a cadence preparation. But actually, expressively, I think it's rather significant, because within that middle section of the piece, he's gone through, as it were, he's condensed the expression and as a personal testimony in a way, those 4 verses. Quite remarkable. And that, I think, is part of the reason why everyone thinks it's such a fine work. There's these unconscious things happening in the music that follow, but yet they follow the essence of what Charlotte Elliott's text is presenting us with.
And that's quite unique, especially in Salvation Army brass band music. I suggest often when we're associating hymns to words, there's a lot of word painting, but actually to condense it and to get the feeling and the meaning of those words into the music rather than the association with a hymn is certainly a very boundary-pushing idea there.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not just word painting, but it's creating the expression of and delivering the expression of what he's trying to say from the language of the music, from the way he's developing his themes, from the counterpoint, from the directions in which the harmony is going. So it's actually inbuilt. It's not laid over the top like a gloss paint, which you can think of a lot of word painting as being.
So that takes us through to letter G, as you've mentioned, and we have this huge climactic, a real emotional treatment of the tune. How does this differ to the very personal, intimate version that we hear at the beginning of the music?
Well, he does the same things. There's a lot of thirds going on. There are octaves in the trombones, which I think is very important. Isn't it interesting? It's the little things. That octave in the trombone had appeared at the start quite, as it were, isolated. Then we've heard it gradually through, and it's only an octave, but actually it seems to gather in importance and intensity. And here we hear it bringing us into G, D, da, da, T, and then we're into the hymn tune. It's a very straightforward harmonization, and he does double up the octaves at times. Soprano goes very high, but it's just a beautifully scored full hymn tune scoring. And if you look at the words, you can see why he's done it like this. There's an assurance, there's a confidence here, isn't there? Just as I am, of that free love, the breadth, length, depth, and height to prove, here for a season, then above, O Lamb of God, I come. I come is very important, actually. You know, it appears at the end of every verse of Charlotte Elliott's poem, but Wilfred doesn't include it in his piece at all. We don't hear oh da da dee. His tune doesn't actually end. He doesn't end either time with the repeat "I come." And in a sense, that is the key that keeps moving us on, because we don't hear that last phrase until the very end of the piece, the last gesture. And I have this feeling that coda, which is, again, looking at the opening, it's looking through a refracted glass, if you like. We're no longer hesitant and unsure and nervous in our prayer, in our pleading. There's a calmness and assurance in it. Instead of the melody going up, dee da 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 da, it now goes down, dee da da, dee da da, dee da 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 da, dee da da da. We're confident in the arms of Jesus, if you like. And then the trombones take da 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 dee, which is a sort of variant of Just As I Am, but it's backwards. Da dee da 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 da. And then he brings that sixth in, we've heard at the very start. Da da dee da da da. He puts it in the trombone part here, condensing that whole phrase. Da 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 dee da da da. But all those little chromatic bits, da 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 da, those unsure, those uncertain bits, they've disappeared. And it's very plain, it's very straightforward. Da da dee da 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 da, like open arms. Da dee. And then the cornets. This is it's Just As I Am. Ba 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 ba. But there's just a simple triad in written cornets, G major. The band comes in, and we're left with just the simplicity of those three notes, and that is I come. We're open, and Wilfred was very concerned in a lot of his music. A lot of the subject matter of his Salvation Army music concerns the journey through life and the assurance of, to quote something he used in one of his other pieces, a heavenly home, the journey to heaven. He was absolutely convinced the assurance, the afterlife. It was the thing that motivated him both musically and particularly spiritually through his life. So that idea of I come, that's the assurance of eternal home. And I think that's what is in the essence of Charlotte Elliott's hymn. Here for a season, then above, O Lamb of God, I come. And I think that's what we hear with just those three angelic cornets at the end, left exposed and dying away.
And it is an absolutely magical moment. There's pure simplicity. And I think
absolutely
it encompasses the whole essence of the piece and the whole essence of faith, really.
Yep.
That we just come as we are. We don't need to make it any fanciful. We don't need to make it complicated. We come as we are. extraordinarily accepted.
And actually, it's very interesting. I think this, of all Wilfred's pieces, he was very proud of this. He said, "I'm rather." He would never say he was proud. He was a very diffident man. He said he was very pleased with this. Oh, I was pleased with this, Paul. And what he meant was he was very proud of the way it did it. But it was a very personal piece to him, I think. And my interpretation, and it's only my view, I think this is his testimony.